Hi, I'm Dr. Hannah de Guzman, and I will be talking about some of the very basic concepts that we need to know before we can begin to interpret visual field results. I'm a glaucoma specialist and I have no relevant financial disclosures. So this is what we will be talking about today. Let's start with the visual field. When we think about vision, we tend to think about visual acuity. We sometimes forget that there are many other aspects to our vision, including the visual field. The visual field has famously been described as an island hill of vision in a sea of darkness. So here's our island. It's tropical. The shape of our island is due to the differences in sensitivity of the different areas of our retina. So in geography, we would talk about elevation, but when it comes to the visual field or perimetry, we talk about different areas of different sensitivities in different areas. Again, in geography, they use contour lines to indicate areas of similar elevation, and in perimetry, we use isopters to indicate areas of similar sensitivity. So here's our sea. And in geography, we would orient ourselves using the directions north, east, south, and west. But in perimetry, we use superior, temporal, inferior, and nasal. Our island hill has a peak, and that is the highest elevation on the island, and it corresponds to the area of highest sensitivity, which is the fovea. Our island also has a deep well which goes all the way down to sea level, and this corresponds to our blind spot. The physiologic blind spot is located about 15 degrees temporal from fixation and is about 1.5 degrees below the horizontal midline. And these are its dimensions. It corresponds to the area of the retina where there are no photoreceptors, which is the optic nerve head. The physiologic blind spot is an area of absolute scotoma. Absolute scotoma means that no matter how bright a light you shine on it, even if it's as bright as the sun, there will be nothing seen at that location. This is as opposed to relative scotomas, which are what we will be talking about later on. It would help us understand perimetry and visual field defects better if we were to map our own blind spots. So pause the video and follow the directions on the screen. When you opened your left eye without moving your thumb and you were able to see your thumbnail once again, this happened because the blind spot is located in an area where the visual fields of the two eyes overlap. And when you lowered your thumb from the blind spot, you did not see a black area there because our brain fills in the blank left by the blind spot with information that it gets from the nearby areas or with what it expects to see. So it's the same for our patients with glaucoma whose scotomas don't appear like black areas in the visual field. It's just areas of missing field or areas that they don't notice. You should have found that your right eye blind spot corresponds in location to this perimetry result. When we present visual fields and when we interpret them, we lay them with the left field on the left and the right on the right. This is to highlight neuro-ophthalmic defects which tend to respect the vertical midline, and it also helps us to understand the fields better and see them the way the patients are seeing them. This is the opposite of the way we present other eye findings, where we usually present the right eye findings on the left side, because we start presenting with the right side usually. So here's our island hill in a sea of darkness. We can divide our island vertically from superior to inferior, crossing at the fovea, and also horizontally. If we were to look at the cross section of our island from nasal to temporal, this is what it would look like. The line would pass through both the fovea and the blind spot. Our visual field extends about 60 degrees superior from fixation and 75 degrees downward from fixation. And horizontally, it extends about 60 degrees nasally and 90 degrees temporally. There's about a 120 degree area centrally where the right and left visual fields overlap, and about 30 to 40 degrees temporally where the visual field is monocular. Let us pause once again and look at how our facial contours affect our visual field. So this is the reason why certain perimetry artifacts can occur, such as a lid artifact or a brow artifact. And it is also the reason why people's visual field extent are not exactly the same. So that's why all the numbers I was giving earlier were all approximations. When we're talking about the visual field, 0 degrees is always set at fixation or corresponding to the fovea. If our hill of vision is lower than it's expected to be, but the loss of height is equal at all points, this is called generalized loss of sensitivity. The shape of the hill of vision still remains the same. This can be due to disease or simply increasing age. On the other hand, focal defects are like pits or potholes on the surface of the island, which is why we tend to use the words shallow or deep to describe visual field defects, the same way we would describe a pothole as being shallow or deep. So we'll go to the next part, which is the visual pathway. The visual pathway starts at the retina, and the organizational pattern that produces recognizable visual field defects starts at the retinal nerve fiber layer. At the level of the RNFL, we can divide the retina across the fovea into superior and inferior halves. That line is called the horizontal raphe. Within each half of the RNFL, we can divide it into bundles that are mostly symmetrical horizontally. This is the papillomacular bundle, which goes almost in a straight line from the fovea to the optic nerve head. The fibers temporal to the fovea take an arcuate path to the optic nerve head. The fibers that come from nasally tend to have a straighter path. So this diagram is what we need to keep in mind every time we interpret a visual field result. So let's take a moment to appreciate the correspondence between the diagram and the actual RNFL. You see the black curved line, which more or less corresponds to the horizontal raphe. It's curved. It's a curved line because we are looking at a curved object. The optics of the globe dictate that the superior retina is responsible for the inferior hemifield and vice versa. In the same way that we divide the RNFL horizontally across the fovea, can we divide it vertically at the fovea into temporal and nasal halves? Does that look right to you? Of course not, it's the left. I should ask, does that look correct to you? No. Actually, that division happens at the level of the optic nerve, specifically a few millimeters posterior to the optic nerve head. Visual field loss due to disease affecting the RNFL, such as glaucoma, will have a pattern that follows the bundle pattern of the RNFL. So here we have a superior paracentral scotoma and a superior nasal step defect. And here are the corresponding areas of RNFL affected. Since it's often difficult to see RNFL loss, we look for more obvious signs of damage at the optic nerve head because these RNFL fibers all extend to the optic nerve and beyond. So how would we know what part of the disc to scrutinize? The way to do it is to follow the bundle's path as it enters the optic nerve head. So in this example, we would look for the corresponding structural defect at the inferior temporal neuroretinal rim. The visual pathway continues as the RNFL axons all form one big bundle at the optic nerve and go on to the brain. So let's discuss the prechiasmal pathway first. A few millimeters behind the optic nerve head, the axons are redistributed so that the fibers from the retinal ganglion cells in the nasal retina are in the nasal part of the optic nerve, and the fibers from the RGCs in the temporal retina are in the temporal part of the optic nerve. Just as it is horizontally, the left side of the retina in each eye receives the light from the right visual field. Right visual field, left side of the retina. And vice versa. At the chiasm, the fibers decussate so that beyond the chiasm, all of the fibers for the right hemifield are now in the left visual pathway and vice versa. These are examples of the types of defects we would see if there were a right optic nerve lesion. These are examples of the types of defects we would see if there was a defect at the chiasm. Take note that it's not always the classic bitemporal hemianopia, but it can be very asymmetrical between the two eyes. So now we go beyond the optic chiasm, which is called the retrochiasmal pathway, and it's made up of the optic tract, the lateral geniculate body, the optic radiations, and the occipital lobe. A right optic tract lesion would produce these kinds of defects, and a right LGN lesion would produce these kinds of defects. Optic radiation lesions differ depending on what lobe is affected, and occipital lesions vary according to the part of the occipital lobe affected and the size of the area affected. So the common elements for retrochiasmal visual pathway lesions are that the defects are hemianopic on the opposite side of the lesion, complete congruous hemianopia is not localizing, meaning it can occur at various points, and this is the reason why we look at visual fields by laying the right visual field on the right and the left visual field on the left. It helps us detect more easily if there are defects respecting the vertical midline and that are hemianopic or bitemporal. So it's very important to remember the anatomy because this will help us figure out where the lesion is. Some patterns of loss are more localizing than others, and others are more generalized or non-specific. And in general, nerve fiber bundle defects would indicate an RNFL defect. Defects that respect the vertical midline are chiasmal or beyond. If it's bitemporal, then it's chiasmal, or if it's homonymous, then it's retrochiasmal. So now we'll talk about visual field testing. Perimetry is the study or measurement of the visual field. What we do is we determine the sensitivity of the various points on the retina to a specific stimulus. A perimeter is the term used to describe an instrument that can use a visual field, and sometimes the term field analyzer is used, usually more specifically for instruments that only measure the central part of the visual field. Why do we need to do perimetry? First of all, it's a direct measure of the actual function or the damage that we're trying to measure or prevent. Unlike, for example, intraocular pressure, which is an indirect measure. So if you were to have a patient with an IOP of, let's say, 25, you wouldn't know what that would mean functionally. So here with perimetry, we get an actual measure of the function. Also, perimetry can help us determine where the lesion is or what the disease type is because of the characteristic patterns of loss that we can sometimes see. We can also establish the extent or the degree of the defect and monitor progression. How we do it, this is the next topic for discussion. Perimetry can be divided into subjective and objective types. Subjective can be divided into kinetic and static, and static can be divided into standard and selective. For objective, the most common types we have are multifocal VEP and multifocal ERG. So we'll talk about kinetic perimetry first. In kinetic perimetry, the stimulus is moved from the periphery to the center until the patient indicates that they've seen it. The stimulus varies in intensity and in size, and it can also vary in speed of movement. This is usually manually tested, and it tends to be very labor intensive and highly operator dependent. And the most common example of this is the Goldmann perimeter. Kinetic perimetry is like mapping our island by flying in at a fixed altitude until you hit the island, and doing that from multiple directions and at multiple elevations. So this is what a kinetic perimetry result would look like. So first, the technician would use a specific stimulus intensity and would map the visual field according to the patient's response for the first stimulus. Then they would draw a line connecting all of the results, and that is one isopter. Then they do it again with a dimmer stimulus or a smaller stimulus, and again until they finally get a good map of the visual field. Static perimetry, on the other hand, the stimulus does not move, it's fixed, but they vary in intensity and they are projected onto fixed locations on the visual field. These tests are almost always automated, and the most common ones that we use are the Humphrey and the Octopus. Static perimetry is like mapping our island by hovering at a fixed location and slowly descending until we hit land, and then repeating the whole process at multiple locations until the whole island is mapped. These are examples of the results of the two most common static standard automated perimetry machines, the Humphrey and the Octopus. So a brief word about objective perimetry. Objective perimetry uses electrophysiology. The advantage of this is that there is no input required from the patients. All they need to do is to fixate on the fixation target. It's a relatively new technology compared with standard automated perimetry or kinetic perimetry, and it's not widely available yet. If you are in a remote location and you need to measure the visual field and you don't have a perimeter, there are still methods that we can use to get a rough idea of the patient's visual field. A confrontation test is a very simple test we can do in the clinic. It's helpful to detect very large and dense defects. Amsler grid, on the other hand, is useful for testing central 10 degrees of vision. A tangent screen is a rather simple test that we can do, which would give us more specific results than a confrontation test. All we need is a black piece of cloth and a laser pointer. From this point on, I'm only going to be talking about subjective perimetry and mostly standard automated perimetry. Standard automated perimetry stimuli can vary in their color, size, intensity, duration, and distribution matrix. Normally, it's a white stimulus on a white background. Our current standard of size are the Goldmann sizes. Traditionally, perimetry stimuli were described according to the angle of incidence. But since most perimeters these days test the patients at a distance of 30 centimeters away, it has become the standard to just use the Goldmann sizes, which were previously described in terms of the minutes of arc they subtended, but now they are described in terms of their area in millimeters squared. So these are the relative sizes of the various Goldmann sizes compared to the blind spot. The most common ones we use these days are the Goldmann size 3 and 5. SAP stimuli can also vary in terms of their intensity. Luminance is the amount of light reflected or emitted from a surface. Luminance units can be candelas per square meter, or apostilbs, or Lamberts. And when we use these kinds of units, the higher the number means the brighter the stimulus. In perimetry, we use decibels, the decibel scale, which is a logarithmic scale, where the higher numbers represent a dimmer stimulus. Therefore, a higher number means that that point of the retina is more sensitive. This makes it easier for us because, first of all, we're dealing with smaller numbers, and it's also more direct or intuitive. A higher number means it's more sensitive, whereas it would be the opposite if we were using the actual luminance units. So this is what we need to remember. Different perimeters can use different background luminances, and their decibel scales can also be different. So the Humphrey and the Octopus, the stimulus luminance at 0 decibels, or in other words, the brightest stimulus available, is different for each machine. So we have to remember that we can't directly compare the results of the two machines. The duration of an SAP stimulus is usually 0.2 seconds or less. And the distribution matrix varies depending on the machine. So the Humphrey uses a grid type, while the Octopus uses a radial distribution. The stimuli of other types of subjective perimetry have other features that are not seen in the standard automated perimetry stimuli, such as speed of movement in kinetic perimetry. Short wavelength automated perimetry, which is a type of selective perimetry, uses a blue stimulus on a yellow background. And frequency doubling technology perimetry, which is another type of selective perimetry, uses a stimulus that looks like it's flickering. Now we'll talk about testing. Perimetry testing can be done either monocular or binocular. The fixation target there's usually a default one, and then for patients with maculopathy, you can request for a larger target. Perimetry machines use various algorithms or strategies to be able to determine the threshold or the sensitivity of the patient's visual field at a particular point. In general, there are three types of strategies: the full threshold, the fast threshold, and the special algorithms. This is an example of how a full threshold algorithm will determine the patient's threshold. So it starts with a very dim stimulus, and if the patient did not see it, then it gives a 4 decibel brighter stimulus. If the patient still did not see it, it goes brighter again by another 4 decibels, but this time the patient saw it. So now the machine goes dimmer again by 2 decibels this time. If the patient did not see it, the machine now goes back to brighter, but this time by only 1 decibel. So this is called bracketing the threshold, and by doing these steps all at one point, the machine is able to determine the patient's threshold at that point. Take note that these stimuli are not presented sequentially all at the same point. So the machine will test one point here, another point here, another point here, then another point here, and then come back here. So the patient does not know where to expect the stimulus. So that's an example of full thresholding. So it crosses the threshold twice. There's the faster thresholding where it only crosses the threshold once. And then there are special algorithms which only measure the threshold at a few locations and then tailors the next stimuli based on the patient's responses to the earlier points. So in Humphrey, they have what's called the Swedish Interactive Threshold Algorithm, or SITA, and in Octopus, they have the dynamic strategy. So full thresholding is very sensitive, but it takes a long time and is prone to artifacts because the patient gets tired or loses concentration. Fast thresholding, on the other hand, is faster, but it's less sensitive. So a good compromise are the special algorithms, which are shorter than the full threshold but more sensitive than the fast threshold. So various machines have different programs that are available for you to choose from. When we choose a program, there are certain parameters that are already set, or they come with that program, and then there are certain parameters that we can choose ourselves, such as the algorithm or strategy to use. Ideally, we should specify what program we want for each individual patient and not leave it up to the staff in the eye center to decide what program to use or to just use whatever is their default program. My second lecture on perimetry, I will be discussing in more detail the different programs. When testing perimetry, there are certain extraneous factors that can affect results. These include the patient's age, where sensitivity naturally decreases with age. Pupil size can affect the results. Refractive error, lids, lashes, or brow, or the facial contours of the patient. Patient experience can have a very big effect on the perimetry results. Media opacities. Dark adaptation can also affect the test, but usually this isn't much of an issue. So thank you for listening, and if you want to know more about perimetry, specifically interpretation of results, or please watch my second video on the visual field.